all about this story this morning, everybody. A Fox News alert, the situation growing more dangerous by the moment, really, in Japan, as more radiation is spewing into the atmosphere from that damaged nuclear plant. David Piper is at Yokota Air Base, just west of Tokyo. Good morning, David.
Good morning. Yes, the nuclear crisis has moved to a much more dangerous level now. The Japanese government says there has been a major radiation leak at that Fukushima nuclear complex, which has had a number of explosions and now a fire there. They're saying that it's moved to a much more dangerous level, and the International Nuclear Agency says that fire at the plant started at a storage pond for spent nuclear fuel. The IAEA says Japanese officials told them the fire was out now because they've reportedly had help from the US military. Radiation levels have soared around the complex now. The Japanese authorities have told people nearby to stay in their homes and seal the doors and windows and to try to avoid going out at all because there's a real danger of them becoming sick. Japanese Prime Minister Naito Kan says radiation has now been released from the 3 reactors at the nuclear plant. He said there is a very high risk of more radiation coming out. The reactors are still overheating, raising the risk of a meltdown. Japan has now imposed a no-fly zone over the plant. Now, higher than normal levels of radiation were reported after the fire in Tokyo, but they're now reported to be dropping. But we now have a report that just outside Tokyo, they're above the normal level by 10 times. Back to you in the studio.
All right, David, thank you very much. David Piper reporting there.
And our news service also says radiation levels are just outside of Tokyo in the Chiba province. They say they are 10 times above normal levels. That by the Kyoto News that's reporting that just as we started this show.
Right. And they're saying in some spots the radiation is 400 times higher than what a person should be exposed to during the course of a year already. So you can imagine, and we've seen these pictures, and they are heartbreaking. Well, first of all, let's take a look at some of the reactors that have gone haywire. Reactor 1, there was an explosion on Saturday, a leak of radioactive steam. Reactor 2, an explosion earlier today, the biggest meltdown threat. Reactor 3, explosion on yesterday, 90% of the core uncovered. And reactor number 4 caught fire earlier today and started spewing radiation. And now there are people walking around in the scrubs, and are they Geiger counters trying to figure out who has some of that contamination?
It is such a frightening situation. And you think about the leader of the country. You know, imagine if the leader of our country, if the president had to say these kinds of things to us. Levels of radiation seem very high. There is still a very high risk of more radiation coming out. That, according to President Kan of Japan. And this from the chief cabinet secretary. He's saying levels are coming out that, quote, clearly have an impact on the human body. And this is very, very frightening stuff. And I go back to the early moments of this whole explosion, and the early reports were that nothing was leaking out, that the earthquake had not. Everything was fine. And that was what we. And at that moment, when we were reporting all of that, we were getting information coming in from bloggers and folks that were sending us information saying, you know, that's not really the case on the ground. And I thought, you know, well, they're probably just alarmists, and indeed, that turned out to be the case.
All right, so let's look at when people are inside the 20-mile zone of where this plant is located, they have to go into containment shelters, containment areas where they get tested for radiation and are kept in containment. There, a mom and a daughter are able to communicate through the wall. You know what's amazing? How cool and calm the Japanese people, the citizens are across the board. They just seem so focused, and there seems no panic amongst them.
You got to believe, though, you know, what's going on the outside may be very different than what's going on the inside. I mean, just look at this picture for a moment. Can you imagine yourself, your own family member, speaking to each other through a window, and your child is in there being tested for contamination?
Right.
You know, and there's more of these pictures to come. One of them, a girl, you know, her dad brings her dog over to see her through the window, and it's just terrifying, really, on many levels.
Speaking of terrifying, it has been a terrifying day on the financial markets in Asia today. The Nikkei index closed down 11%. At its deepest part, it was down 14%. Keep in mind, it dropped 6%. And there's an analyst for Morgan Stanley who has a quotation this morning. He says, what the world is watching right now is to figure out whether or not this plant will turn into Chernobyl.
And here's the thing. Can you imagine this? The earthquake not affecting the markets as much, the tsunami not affecting the markets as much. It's all about the radiation and the nuclear power plants. And the fact is that General Electric built it in the 1970s, so we're bringing more people over there to help out. And the fact of the matter is, what they're hearing from the Prime Minister and what they're hearing from the Cabinet Minister, what they're hearing from experts is they don't know. Right. And when they don't know, the markets react the way they react. In fact, many people think it could be a lot worse considering how little they know about where this is going. And arguably, this could be the most tense day to date. And considering what these people have been through from Friday when it all hit, that's saying a lot.
Indeed.
I think given what's happened there, to see a 14% drop that comes back to an 11% drop, I think it could have been a whole lot worse than it was in the market. But I think you're right. It's that uncertainty about these radiation levels that is really rocking.
And here's the quote
story.
that hit me is Michio, who you have a lot of America's Newsroom we have on. He's quoted today as saying as a physicist, this is getting worse by the hour, and we haven't hit bottom yet.
Right. And so it's a race against time as the rescue workers try to find people buried in the rubble. And there was an urgent that came out on the wires just about an hour ago, a story about a 70-year-old woman whose house was swept away by the tsunami. She was found in the house this morning. She apparently is suffering from hypothermia, and she's been carted off to the hospital, but she is alive.
And how about the picture of the little girl? That the 4-month-old baby girl is just look at that. I mean, it's hard to add words to that picture.
Wrapped in the blanket, the guy from the army holding it. That has been such a picture of comfort for the people of Japan who are looking so desperately for some good news. And that news, amid the rubble, great.
It's been a few days buried in the rubble, and the father was being reunited with the baby. And you can think about how cold it's been, and the fact that that baby more than likely was dehydrated in that small little body and able to survive, and evidently, according to reports, is okay. On a lesser note, but very important to families, we're talking about the survival of 2 dogs. When the word come the tsunami was hitting after the earthquake, a father ran up and grabbed his 12-year-old daughter, and they left. In the backyard were 2 dogs, a Labrador as well as a Sheltie, tied to a shed. Somehow these dogs were able to chew their way free of the ropes and ran up the outer stairs of the 2nd floor and somehow survived the tsunami. When they came back, the dogs were barking and alive.
Fantastic.
Yeah, the girl was really happy because her dad said she was so angry with me for leaving the dogs here. But, of course, and they said they can't bring the dogs to the shelter, so they're going back and forth to visit them every day because he said, you know, you can't compare what the people in the shelter are going through with our own situation and trying to save our 2 dogs.
And speaking of trying to save the dogs, while the dad had taken the 12-year-old daughter away in the wake because the tsunami was coming, his 20-year-old daughter had gone back. I'm going to go save the dogs. And then the police said, you can't go any further. And so she felt heartbroken, and then, as nature would have it, the dogs are alive.